Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Michael Barnathan, the founder of many projects, including Project Polymath, which we'll get into today, as well as overall just a techie in general, a polymath, obviously because he's on the show, and an engineer and machine learning expert. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Great to be here.
So this is a show about becoming a poly-innovator, or as I call it, like a polymath of innovation. Please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hey. It's good to meet all of you, and whatever your vision is, keep driving at it. I think the world needs that level of diversity and creativity. So
Definitely.
Really proud of what you're all doing.
Well, and thank you for addressing the audience in such a way too. And I think that with your Project Polymath, we have a lot of similarities, and I think we'll definitely go into that later on. Hello, and welcome to the Polymath Polycast interviews and discussions. Please share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Something that nobody knows. Some people know that I play music, but very few people know that I'm learning a new instrument at the moment. It's an instrument called the erhu. It's a traditional Chinese string instrument, not unlike a violin.
Oh, that's cool.
And it's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's like going back to the start of trying to learn a completely new skill. So it's challenging, but I'm enjoying it.
Definitely. And it's kind of funny you bring up that new skill acquisition. I do feel like polymaths have a natural knack or curiosity, of course, too, being able to pick up a new skill. And the challenge of that is what drives our curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, some of it also is the thrill of learning something new, of like making a new connection. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because the beginner zone is kind of a place that's uncomfortable. You can't really do a lot with it yet. Mm-hmm. But somehow just like launching into the unknown and like starting something new up just kind of has a thrill to it.
Oh yeah, definitely. And one of my pursuits for self-development was learning how to sing by going to karaoke, like religiously, multiple times a week. And the first night I ever sang, my leg was shaking so bad I couldn't get past that nervousness. But then since then, the thrill of it is so much more fun. But as I got really good at it, I was like, okay, now I need a new challenge. So let's go learn how to do salsa dancing or something like that.
Yeah, and the more you do of it too, the less stage fright you end up with. I was the same way when I started to perform, and it eventually does diminish.
Definitely. And so this new acquisition of this instrument is probably your new challenge. Is there any other areas that you're trying to challenge yourself?
I mean, just switch companies, so that's always a new experience. I was at Niantic before, the company that does Pokemon Go. And now I'm at Facebook. So it's been a bit of a trip trying to just learn all of the new things, particularly in the pandemic situation.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And those are actually related to some questions we're going to talk about later on today too. But I guess kind of going straight into it, how was it working for Niantic?
Oh, it was great. I mean, it was, as far as the environment goes, it took a lot of Google's culture with it. And Google kind of has a legendary culture, so I don't think I need to explain too much of what they were doing, but everybody was very helpful to each other. We built a really strong team of really strong engineers and scientists, and it was a very collaborative environment, very open and very creative. I enjoyed it a lot.
Definitely. Did you have a hand in like the Harry Potter thing, or was it just Pokemon Go?
I personally did not have a hand in the development of Harry Potter, but what I was doing over there was leading their machine learning team. Cool. So Pokemon Go, we supported all of their projects. Pokemon Go is the biggest, of course, but we also supported Harry Potter and Ingress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's interesting is that I actually came across Ingress way before Pokemon Go was popular, and I almost got around to downloading it. I wish I did because it's an obviously interesting concept. What was your take on it?
Yeah, it was a groundbreaking game when it first came out. So the company was founded in roughly 2011, I believe. As a spin-off from Google, and Ingress was basically a demonstration of what they could do in the real world. And it spawned an entire category. I mean, it laid the groundwork for Pokemon Go, and it opened up an entirely new category of AR games.
Definitely, and I love the way that kind of makes a analogy to success in general. Just because your first endeavor may not be successful, or that one I think was at least somewhat interesting, people actually cared a lot about it, but it obviously wasn't the groundbreaking success that they got them to be known for until they had Pokemon Go. So they laid the groundwork, like you said, for the next new project.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's critical generally when you're trying to embark on a new path. You want to be building on your successes. That's actually one of the learning strategies that I think is useful to try and acquire a new skill. You know, you learn a new concept and you use that now as a foundational piece of knowledge to jump off in the next direction.
Yeah, like translating ideas. If you can find the common cores between, let's say, like gardening and lawn care or something like that, obviously very similar, but have their own specific niches and details. If you can find a translation, you can learn it very quickly.
Yeah, or even further afield, like for example, music has the notion of chord progressions. You can move from like a 1 chord to a 4 chord or a 5 chord, and that's like a very common thing. Whereas it's less common to go from, let's say, 1 to 2. In computer science, we've got something called a Markov chain, which basically models that same like state transition type of thing going on. So you could take knowledge out of one field that, you know, seems very distant and apply it completely differently in a new one.
Yeah, and this is something I've actually talked a lot about on the podcast as well, having that forest of knowledge. So a lot of people focus too much on having one big tree, having that specialist of knowledge, and the groundwork is really nice. They might have a jack of all trades mindset, but as a polymath, we have multiple trees, so we can see a bigger picture. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the things it gives you is perspective, because you've got multiple skill sets and you're building sort of dependency graphs along each one. You have the ability to just pluck things out of one area and just apply them in a new one. And you start to see that there are some areas of knowledge that people consider to be very different, like certain areas of mathematics, physics, computer science, that actually have similar patterns. And one of the things I've been doing subconsciously mostly as I've been building up these different areas is recognizing common patterns when they occur in different contexts.
Okay, I didn't know that was a close point there. So that's fantastic. I think that it also comes down to systematic thinking as well. If you can see the systems in place, you'll definitely see the overlap between the systems.
Right, exactly. And the more knowledge you acquire, the more insight you'll be able to derive around that.
Definitely. And kind of going into the questions then, let's start with your goal. As it quite resonates with my own here, yours is to spark a new renaissance. So tell me more about that.
Yes, so that's quite a lofty goal. But let me break down what I think is going on. So I think the critical point there is that right now there's a tremendous amount of pressure in society to specialize. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we've built an economy on top of what sociologists call a model of organic solidarity, which means it's like a giant assembly line. You know, each person has their own individual competency. And these are assembled usually by someone whose competency is like the strategy of assembling these things into something useful. And that scales, that works, if you have a defined goal in mind. The problem is this is great for achieving a single goal. Like you're working in a company, your company is producing some sort of widget, everybody has their piece, it comes together, it's great. It works for that. But the problem is that in this arrangement, at least half of the population, probably much more than half, is on the leaf of that tree. And what I mean by that is like most of these people are not doing this strategy. They're not being paid to think at all, actually, in a way. What they're being paid to do is execute in their given skill. And that's a huge amount of organizational overhead because it's an opportunity cost, essentially. The organization is losing a lot of its creative capacity because most of the people in the organization don't feel like they can create. So this is not optimal. Like if we want to do more than just execute, if we want to actually create new things at scale, then we have the wrong model.
Definitely. And it follows a more of a supply chain management kind of aspect where you have point A to point B and people focus too much on that boom, 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 and not being able to change that order of operations. They're just focusing on just executing, like you're saying, but not being able to be innovative.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, people aren't machines. The economy sometimes tries to treat them that way. But I think if you can unlock everybody's ability to contribute ideas in some form, then you'll see these companies actually tend to get stronger over time because they'll be getting more innovations. I think Google is actually an example of a company that's done this phenomenally well. They've created more of a bottom-up innovation pipeline among their employees. They didn't just make them executors. And as a result, now they're one of the largest companies in the world. They're in pretty much everything that relates to the internet. And they've become very, very successful as a result of it. And I think we could see more of that across the entire economy.
Yeah, and it comes back to that systematic thinking that we were talking about earlier, where if a company can apply that systematic thinking using the employees as nodes of that system, they can have a much wider net of innovation, knowledge, and experimentation, so they can actually innovate a lot quicker and become a lot more successful.
Right. And I think getting that scale is what's going to produce something like a renaissance. If you look back at the ages that we would compare this to, the golden ages of history, the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, the golden age of Islam, arguably the Edo period in Japan, they were characterized, like the reason that they're golden ages is that they just had this flourishing of new ideas, all coming at once. There were people trying to design flying machines in 1100 AD. It was nuts. And we could do this, but we don't have the right model to do this. We have a model right now that identifies a single goal, and you just have to chase it.
Well, and this stems from the Industrial Revolution, where they were trying to get these people specialized for those certain roles. Like you said, do this one thing, execute on this one thing, and then the next person will do the next part. But now that we've had a more almost internet renaissance at this point, I think we're approaching the fourth Industrial Revolution, as people say. It's going to open up for that new people. What do you think that's going to take in the next 10 years?
I mean, so over the next 10 years, I think we've built out a lot of the foundational infrastructure in terms of the internet. I feel like in terms of the basic development of the internet, we've kind of filled in a lot of those niches by now. So what I'm expecting is we're going to see more things being built on top of it now. AI, for example, is one of the newer trends that's being built on top of the fact that we now have these large data sets we've collected over this network. And we're able to start doing very interesting things that even 10 years ago, we just did not have the data to do. So I'm continuing to see a lot of those basic abstractions starting to be built up. Toolkits, programming languages, different tools that we could use to sort of reach the table stakes of an internet-enabled company or an AI-enabled company, and then start actually building more things. Go ahead.
I was just saying, it reminds me of the Internet of Things kind of revolution as well, that new micro technologies that are being developed, all these different connections to the devices that are connected to the internet, and how that's going to be an incorporated system into cities and the homes as well.
Right. And at this point, we have most of the infrastructure we need to do something like that. There was a concern a little while ago that we would eventually run out of IP addresses and that the internet wouldn't scale to having, your refrigerator having its own internet address. But I think we've largely addressed those challenges, and now it's just a matter of scaling the underlying technology down.
Well, and that comes down to the IPv4 versus IPv6. Yeah. And I think there's more addresses that could be made with IPv6 than like atoms in the universe at this point, or something like that.
Yeah, it's like 2 to the 128th power or something. Yeah. It's a huge number. We're not running out of those.
Well, and they said that like at this point, most people have around 7 devices connected to the internet, but it's going to dramatically evolve into about 30 in the next coming decade or two, and obviously more and more as the decades come on. And so that's why people are worried about it. But it's interesting to see that develop.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised the number is that low. I would have suspected it was closer to 15 or 20 right now. But that's going to increase because the underlying processors are becoming cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean, now you can go out and buy something like a Raspberry Pi, like a little computer the size of maybe like a postage stamp, a little bit bigger perhaps. But you can go out and buy one of these things for like $10, $15. And it's got networking, and you can hook it up to the internet. It's running Linux. You can do all sorts of things with it. And this is just going to continue. I mean, the underlying processors that are powering these things are going down from dollars to cents at this point.
So going back to that idea of the new renaissance that we were talking about, this kind of idea that you had led you to develop the Project Polymath, which is one of the projects that I found you by. Ironically, I've actually tried to I've been going to that website every year since 2017, trying to reach out to you. I didn't realize who you were at the time because I didn't see any particular, I think I saw the blog post, but I thought maybe you were just one of the people on there. I didn't realize you were the instigator of it. And so I was like trying to find hey, how can I contact this person or these people? And so it was interesting how that came about. So it seems like a university of sorts for the multi-disciplined. How does that
Right. Yeah, so I was examining this ecosystem a while back. So if my goal is to start a renaissance, okay, great, I've identified what I want to do. And I think that's actually very critically important to creating something new. Like first, start with what you actually want to make. And so I started with, I want to create a renaissance. Now looking at the landscape of society, where does that fit in? There are a few different places we can try to plug it into. We can try plugging it into the economic model. That seemed challenging. Everybody is focused on optimizing their own metrics. There's an economic incentive to keep sort of like pushing for the short-term wins in the economy. It didn't seem like the right place.
Right.
But the university is already a place where some of that direct economic pressure is relaxed. And people have more of an opportunity to pursue different fields because they're actually interested in them.
Definitely.
So I thought, how could we flip this on its head to actually start scaling up the graduation of universal thinkers? And I came up with the idea of starting with goals. You know, people identifying what they were passionate about changing in the world rather than what they wanted to be.
Yeah.
So instead of saying you want to be an electrical engineer, you start off with, well, actually, I want to create drones that will take people across, I don't know, bodies of water. I guess that's just a helicopter, but you you get the idea. You start out with a goal, and then you turn that into a series of actionable projects that you can collaborate with other people, and that is your campus experience. And then the courses are basically supporting those projects. So you're taking something in mechanical engineering, something in aerospace, so you can understand the aerodynamics of your idea. You're maybe partnering with people who design the rotors, and then in the end of it, you start actually assembling this thing while you're still in school.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the compelling thing about that is that, you know, that's just one example, but if you're taking this and you're throwing thousands of people into it, then you're starting to systematically graduate people who are skilled at thinking in this way. And that's something that in history has never really been done.
Yeah.
Or at least I've never seen any example of it being done.
I have one idea. It was like Benjamin Franklin tried to have this like mastermind of sorts. And that's
yes, the junto.
Yeah, and so that's kind of one idea, but it obviously wasn't executed super well. And you know what's interesting is that what resonates with me quite a bit is that idea of that communication between the two. You actually said something that was really interesting there. It's to start with what, which I think that kind of came down with what goal. And it reminds me obviously of Simon Sinek's start with why, and that goal why. And then you break it down like, how am I going to do it? What courses do I need to take? And then you go down to what, and what's the execution of it. And so it's interesting how you were able to create that system. And the reason why I see parallels between us is that, not to talk too much about myself, but I want to get your feedback on this, is that before PolyInnovator, where this polycast came from, I started working on what I called the United Living Construct, which was my own Project Polymath. I wanted to create a hub of innovation and find people like you and I and people who want to approach this interdisciplinary thinking and bring them together.
Yeah, I think that's critical. Like the innovation cannot really happen in a vacuum. No matter how many skills you individually know, you're going to be benefited by finding other people who are equally skilled, who can add their own perspective. I mean, even when you're learning a new skill, I'm sure everybody's had the experience where they've learned something in isolation for a while, and then suddenly they go out to somebody else and, you know, share that skill with them in some way. And suddenly it's like they get a brand new perspective on things. Like, it doesn't matter if you've been studying it for 10 years. Still, as soon as you talk to a second person, sometimes you'll get things you weren't expecting.
I got a perfect example, actually. When I was learning to sing, someone who I knew who's a much better singer than I was, he told me that if I wanted to sing a higher pitch, to widen my lips and almost smile when I'm doing it, and it allows for a much bigger range of being able to go higher. So it's just, I would never have known that or thought of that.
Yeah, exactly. So by speaking to those people, and especially by setting up an environment where you can easily collaborate with those, to remove the roadblocks that normally prevent people from working together and make it a smoother experience, I think that's a really valuable aspect of building something like that. Because the university, you know, with COVID now, the university's relevance is starting to get questioned a bit.
Yeah.
Because people think it's all about going to see a professor speak and, you know, having like classes and then you get a degree, and that's part of it. But really the value of a university is that you get to be with other people who are innovating, and you get to work in a context where you could explore your own ideas with them. And they could explore theirs, and you can create, not to be too corporate speaky, but you can create synergies with what they're doing.
Well, and I think it's kind of funny how you attune the synergy with corporate, but it is something that as human natures, we thrive on that synergy. We thrive on that interpersonal connection, being able to cultivate new ideas that way. And when I actually created United Living Construct, the reason why I stopped pursuing it is I realized I wasn't good enough. I realized that I needed to learn more, and I knew that other people would want to learn more as well. And so one kind of thing I was always interested in is online learning, self-education through courses like MOOCs, OpenCourseWare, that kind of thing, and stuff like that you had on your blog, on the Project Polymath, all those new interesting projects. So I created the modular degree, this self-education framework, quite similar to what you were doing as well. And I wanted to lead that into the United Living construct down the line. So where do you think that having peers involved with that modular education, that do-it-yourself kind of pathway will lead into?
I mean, what I was hoping to get out of Project Polymath, the role I saw of that peer collaboration was ultimately seeding the next great innovations, the next companies, the next great pieces of research, and actually throwing these people together and then having lasting collaborations emerge out of them. So I think just creating those connections, like allowing people the chance to work together, even if they're not succeeding within the school environment, I think is the real value there. Because some of the connections that get forged there are going to persist, and they're going to intensify as people continue to work on more things.
Definitely. And I think that you were trying to almost change the school environment through that Project Polymath.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So right now we have a schooling environment that's fairly vocational. And unfortunately, people sometimes see it that way too, that this is their ticket into the economy. And that's something that I feel like we've conflated with the university. That's not the original purpose of the university.
Yeah.
And that prompts kind of a reevaluation of like what the role of vocational training should be in society, because I think that is important, that people are able to find a way to participate in the economy as it is. But I also think there needs to be the element of choice and of self-directed learning and of exploration. And these are things that the education system, maybe with a few exceptions, doesn't really provide to people.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people, like you said, find it as a vocational training for college. College is that vocation training, but oftentimes it doesn't actually lead you into a job, and you often end up working some entry-level position anyways at the end.
Right, and also people, for a while, they kind of assumed that the university was a guarantee of a job. And I think that maybe for a while that was mostly true, but what really guarantees the job is the differentiator. And the problem is when a university education becomes universal enough, then eventually it stops being a differentiator just having a degree. You need to do something more if you actually want to get noticed.
Definitely, and it's the interdisciplinary people who are able to prove that generalist amount of knowledge. So it's interesting to note that new renaissance is your ultimate goal. Why don't you think that it could happen already without you, or sooner per se?
So I'm sure over a long enough span of time, it probably could happen without me. I feel like a lot of these things, they get in the air and then eventually they change. But I'm here. I have to act in some way. And, my choice is to try and accelerate that if I can.
I love that. I didn't want to sound like accusatory or like why you? No, but because
it's a fair question.
Well, it's interesting to think about people's mindsets behind it, and that maybe one little thing you say behind that mindset might actually be something very crucial to that, be a catalyst. Do you think that it might be a magnum opus of sorts?
That is, I mean, I was originally hoping it could just be something that we launch the university and build towards, but this is quite a lofty goal. So you have to accept that it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of effort, it's going to take a lot of resources. So we got to a certain point with the initial launch of Project Polymath. We started ramping up the courses. We turned out to be slightly ahead of our time there because this was shortly before Khan Academy sort of became like very big, and MOOCs apparently were something, but they weren't necessarily the way that we were going to do this.
So this is what, 2013?
This was about 2009, actually.
Oh, wow. So even, because MOOCs really kind of came about in around 2012. So you really were ahead of the time.
Yeah, we started Project Polymath in 2008 on Pi Day, actually. And 2009, we started up the MOOC strategy. And the plan was to charge nominal admission for some courses and just receive donations from the other ones, and start actually building up subsequent courses off of that. And we got a lot of interest in the courses, but we didn't get a ton of subscriptions or a ton of donation flow. So the finances of it turned out to be the sticking point there.
Yeah, and I guess, like you said, it might be too early. I honestly think that if we were to redo it at this point in this modern age, it might actually be much more viable, especially considering the whole coronavirus and people being at home. There's a lot less, what's the word I'm looking for, belief in the school systems. And I think that an alternative like that would be much more appreciated.
Yeah, and I think we still have to meet people where they are, in the sense that right now their goals are they still want to get a job using their education. And that's, they have an economic incentive for that. It's not a value thing. It really is just, this is the way society is set up. So we need to tie into that somehow. I think we need to show them that the courses that we're offering can provide them with that economic value, but also can, spur their creativity in a new direction.
I think the modular degree fits in there quite a bit, but how do you think that we could do that then? I had a proper way I was going to ask that, but how do you think we could do that?
So one of the most popular courses that I launched on that platform was one that was called How to Learn Everything. It was learning how to learn, essentially. And that was kind of foundational. Like, if I were structuring a curriculum around this, that would probably be the 101. Because that accelerated everything else.
Yeah.
And I think showing people that knowing how to learn, knowing how to acquire new knowledge, and then following it up with the actual knowledge that they cared about in the economy, would make them much stronger at acquiring those skills over time. And we got a lot of positive commentary about that. Like, they applied a lot of the strategies they learned in that course, and they actually used them to accelerate the rest of their learning.
You know what's fascinating is how similar-minded we are, because for the modular degree, I wanted to create a course where people can understand how to build their own, so they could choose whatever topics they want to go into and learn. But the first thing I did was make a mini course on self-education, or as I call it, self-edu-devment. So edu, development, like education development and improvement. I feel that self-improvement and self-development are all similar, but not quite the same. So this self-edu-devment concept was the first little mini course that people can take and are required to take in order to do the other one, where I talk about the foundation of education, the consistency of the atomic habits, you can even say from James Clear, of the improvement, and then the catalyst for exponential growth with the development. So it's very interesting how we are on the same page.
Yeah, and then I think there's one other piece, which is the exploration aspect of things. You want people to be able to explore different fields, because we've currently created a system where that exploration is never really encouraged. People are expected to, they make one decision in their college educations: what major are they going to choose? And that's an agonizing enough decision that actually people very often will freeze up or be very uncertain about what they want to do. And I think if we can drive a bit more choice and exploration and self-direction into that whole structure, we can make people much more comfortable with the idea of taking risks and following their own ideas, rather than following the robo path, as they call it, like sort of going in the direction that society expects them to go.
Definitely. And college should be around a point of exploration or experimentation. And you know what's interesting is that I created this concept, I coined this concept from gaming. So in video games, you have skill trees. We go down different paths, and I try to apply that towards education. So skill tree based learning. So if a particular path is becoming, you're not engaged with it anymore, it's causing too much anxiety, not enough actual learning, or perhaps you're just no longer interested in it in general, you can go down a different pathway of that skill tree. So and so I think that'd be, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that's great. That relates to the idea of pivoting as well. So you're in a certain place on this tree, and sometimes you start exploring a field and you realize, oh, that's not what I thought that was.
Yeah.
And that happens to everybody. I mean, even learning new things, I still have certain preferences for and against certain subjects. So given what you've already learned, like, what can you do with it that would make it more enjoyable at any given point in time? How do you reroute when you're already on this pathway and you've realized that either something is blocked to you or it's just not enjoyable to you? And having a tree allows you to do that.
Well, and I think there's a certain point where you need some kind of mentor or peer-based help for your learning.
That's key. That's key too.
Well, that way you know what plateaus you're hitting. So I'm a swim coach, and there's a lot of people who don't necessarily know when they're hitting a plateau when swimming. And having that coach identify that physical barrier or sometimes mental barrier is often really important, regardless of what skill this is. But I think that there also is some self-awareness aspect behind it too. You can identify it most of the time on your own if you know the knowledge well enough. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah, and you really need to explore to know what your preferences will be. You can have a good academic idea of what a field might be like, but actually doing it, like being down in the weeds and seeing what actually goes into accomplishing something in a given domain is always a discovery.
Yeah, definitely. So you're a driven entrepreneur. You've created quite a many companies and projects. So what started the 5 kind of companies that you've worked on?
Sounds good. So the first one grew out of my PhD research, which was in it was in applying machine learning to medical imaging. So we would diagnose scans automatically using computer algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
Really cool stuff, and it's something that gets tried every 5 years or so in different iterations. Machine learning continues to advance, so every time people bring newer tools to the fray. But at the time, we had gotten accuracy on a level that other people had not on a standard mammography data set. So this was detecting breast cancer.
Wow.
So the first startup that I started was basically an attempt to commercialize that. And that was mostly a learning experience, to be honest. I was fairly inexperienced at entrepreneurship at the time, and I was also not very experienced with the commercial aspect of the domain, even though I was with the research aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up running into some regulatory barriers, no surprise,
Yeah.
and ended up going in circles over the funding with the FDA staff, and ended up just sort of like deferring that one and moving on to something else. The second startup was the one, not counting the 2 nonprofits actually. So that 5 actually is 3 full startups and then like 2 nonprofit organizations.
Right.
So I feel like the second startup that I launched, which was a daily deals app called Clipless, one of the first location-driven mobile apps actually, which was I think what made it successful. That was the one that really took off. So we ran that one quite quickly without the regulations because it was not a regulated space. We were able to drive value to a lot of people really quickly, and we ended up getting tens of thousands of users over the 3 months following the launch, and then quickly got acquired by one of our backend providers.
Tell me a little bit more of those nonprofits then too.
Yeah, so the nonprofits, Project Polymath is obviously one. That one is what I would call dormant at the moment. I realized that I personally need to be in a better place to be able to fund that. And then we as an organization also need to come up with a better value proposition that's going to resonate with people and sort of like share economic gains with them. Because I think that's ultimately what's going to get the funding into that organization. But we've accomplished a fair amount. We drove a movement there. Obviously, you found me through this. And many others as well have come together over the idea that the economic model that we have today does not need to be a fundamental constant of what we're doing, and that we can restructure a society for more creativity. So that was successful by that measure. And then the other one we started was a response to that, a scaled down version of Project Polymath known as the Mountaintop Program. We met with some pretty good success there. So we actually went into K-12 schools in the New York City area. And we brought in about 75 mentors, entrepreneurs, industry experts, college professors. And we actually had them sit down with the students and brainstorm projects of the students' own designs, and then actually mentor them through the actual creation of that project. It culminated in a demo day at the end where students got employment opportunities, college scholarships in some case, a few internships. But overall, like it was like an accelerator experience in the classroom, which is what led us to define the tagline for it, the accelerator for everyone.
I love that.
Yeah, and we've spun off a lot of smaller organizations now that are repeating the model in other areas. So in terms of impact, I think that one had some really nice ripple effects.
Well, and it probably gives you a lot more experience too to be able to translate over to Project Polymath. And I wish that when I was in K through 12, I would have something like that to accelerate my interests. I personally have always been interested in business ever since I was a child, and
Nice.
I'd even tell people for my to my mom and grandma for like my 9th birthday, I wanted office supplies for the birthday so I could become a businessman. And as I got
awesome.
and as I got older, I'd be saying CEO, and then a little bit older than that, I would say CEO of an international company driven to innovate technology and ideology. That was coming out of teenagers' mouth. And as
nice, you even had the company name defined already.
Yeah, and so it's just interesting too how I was already on that path. So if I had an accelerator like that, it would have been really helpful. And I think there's a lot of other minds like us that would benefit from it.
Yeah, and there's a huge opportunity gap there. So we targeted underserved schools in New York initially because there are populations that have great ideas. That actually connects to the philosophy that you can find great ideas anywhere. but there are barriers in place. There are reasons that those people can't actualize their fullest potential. And by deploying those resources strategically, we thought we could have a huge impact on surmounting those barriers and showing them that they actually can do these things.
Well, man, we're already like, what, 40 minutes in, and we've only gotten through a few questions, but we've had such a fantastic conversation so far. It's great.
Yeah, it's been awesome.
So pivoting just a little bit, I saw this. You got featured in TechCrunch twice. So how did that come about?
Yeah, so those were both around clipless. That was definitely the effort that got the most press, which I think is a little bit disappointing, actually, because I would have preferred that Project Polymath got more of the press. I thought that was the more fundamental thing, but yeah, TechCrunch is a startup publication, so you get startup things.
I will write an article on Project Polymath.
Sounds great.
I'll make a note there.
Thanks for that.
Yeah,
so the TechCrunch appearances were around 2 milestones that we had in clipless. One was the actual launch, where because we were starting a new category of mobile app there, and we were kind of on the leading edge, and also we made the decision to go with Android first, which back then was they could sort of frame that as part of a narrative of like Android gaining dominance over the iPhone. We got featured pretty prominently there. And that drove a huge amount of adoption for us. That was where the traffic really started to spike. The second time that we got featured was the acquisition by 8coupons, which was originally one of the providers of our deal stream. So we wanted to be the most comprehensive deal stream on the internet. How do you get that? You aggregate the ones that already are, and that's what we did. So we had a pretty good contact with their leadership, and things looked right. They found the mobile app to be strategic, and so we were able to turn that into an acquisition.
One thing I'm seeing is a synchronicity behind a lot of your projects. So you learned a little bit about virality from clipless. You learned how the Renaissance approach for that magnum opus of sorts for your life there, that new modern Renaissance from Project Polymath and Mountaintop, and that new way of approaching education. I think that some new endeavor, if you can try to combine what you've learned from all your different previous endeavors, you might even be a lot more successful too.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going with a lot of this. So what I'm trying to do is exercise new areas of the entrepreneurial life cycle where I feel like I don't yet have enough experience. And of course, trying to find places that are going to be viable companies too. I'm not just trying to learn out of this. I'm also trying to build a pathway to do something big like Polymath over time. Yeah, combining that with an actual business idea, but also finding new ways to learn and to bring new skills into the next thing.
I love it. Man, after my own mind. So this leads into my next question then. What is a universal thinker?
That's a good question. So a universal thinker, I believe, is somebody who takes the philosophy that that you can take ideas from one domain of knowledge and apply them to a new one.
Okay.
They're someone who has fully mastered what I consider to be one technique of learning how to learn, which is learning by analogy. Internalizing patterns, basically, from each individual area that you're picking up, and then applying those patterns to new situations, which is the foundation, actually, of a lot of learning within fields as well. I mean, if you look at within computer science, there's the notion of a design pattern, which is basically like, oh, there's a problem here. You know, it's probably amenable to this type of solution because this is the way that people have always ended up solving these things. And so let's learn these patterns and actually apply them in new situations. It's like doing that, but actually doing so across fields of study.
I think that when I approach the idea of a polymath, and especially explaining it to people, I try to explain it in that universal thinker concept of that interdisciplinary translating in a way. So you can actually take each tree of your knowledge and be able to branch them out to each other. Elon Musk has a concept quite like that too. I can't remember what he's talking about when it comes to his principles, but it'd be interesting to look up. And then it also reminds me of the Feynman technique as well.
Oh yeah, the Richard Feynman, you mean, the physicist?
Richard Feynman, yeah. And so he talks about breaking it down. He doesn't necessarily talk too much about that translation or universal aspect, but he does talk about how to break down a concept. And I think that if you could break it down either cross-branching or just by itself too, it's important.
Right, exactly. And yeah, I really subscribe to that idea of like a library of patterns. I think if you can build up those, then you can find all sorts of situations where you can end up applying your existing knowledge.
Where do you see mental models then as patterns or systematic thinking?
So models are essentially patterns applied to knowledge.
Okay.
You're taking your existing skills and your existing models that you've built up out of past experience, and you're combining them with new data in some sort of way. And then you're building up a new model of a domain.
I'm interested in learning more about that because that's something I'm not very knowledgeable about it. One thing I did want to kind of pivot to, because that with your Renaissance kind of philosophy there, what do you think drives towards a prosperity of humanity?
That is an interesting question. So I think the prosperity of humanity is tied in with both the ability to create and the ability to execute. So you need both, and that's kind of the tricky bit about this. You need to be able to forge out into the unknown and create new ideas. You also need to be able to recruit other people to your cause, to build up a team around those ideas, to handle all of the skills required. And you can handle many of those, but chances are on your own, you probably can't handle every one of those. So finding people who also have that ability to overlap with you, and also allowing them to have an impact on the idea as well. So that kind of relates to what I was saying in the beginning of this interview, where you want the people who work with you to also have a say, because that will lead you to your next idea. And so that's the model that I think works. You find people around the idea that you're currently working on, and you start preparing the next one with them. And then they get a chance to have impact on the strategy as well. And then collectively you start executing and bringing more people into the circle and continuing.
Yeah, that reminds me of the AC versus DC kind of thing when Thomas Edison versus Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla had a better idea,
Very much.
but he was a solo person. He was always on his own, didn't really collaborate very much. Whereas Edison had a whole group of like interns and inventors underneath him and with him trying to collaborate and create new ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it was actually Tesla finding Westinghouse that I think gave him a lot of the influence that he ended up having. So he was a great innovator. He would have invented things on his own, regardless of whether he met Westinghouse. But I think having that backing allowed him to have much more financial clout to be able to go up against Edison, to promote his own ideas. And I think that's a very important aspect that maybe many creators end up missing, that your ideas just in the wild, just if you think of them, are not necessarily going to be accessible to the masses. You need to find somebody who really specializes in getting them out there too.
Like a marketer of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, marketer is one way to put it, but just somebody who's good at capturing people's attention. We're in the attention economy now.
Yeah.
You know, anybody who can get 5 minutes of fame on TikTok or something is golden. So if you can find someone who can recruit that around your idea, that's very powerful.
You know what's interesting is that I was thinking about that when I created the United Living Construct. So I had this 3 kind of tiers, so to speak. They're not necessarily like levels, but they're more of like circles of areas of expertise. So you had the uniters, so people who could bring people together, almost like politicians in a way, or like Martin Luther King. So people who could be that presence, that keynote, or whoever could be presenting. And then you had the leaders who are a little bit different. They were like the day-to-day operations, the people who could actually operate the business, or the entrepreneurs, that kind of thing.
Right.
And finally, you had the creators. Well, not finally, but you had the creators who were actually the producers, the ideas, the innovators. And then I had one more kind of overarching one, which was a polyusian, which is essentially just a polymath, someone who could do all 3.
Right. Yeah, and I think learning elements of all 3 is quite useful in terms of actually creating something. You know, you can find people who are really good at 1 or 2 of these, and it's worth partnering with those when you can. But I think every leader needs to understand some aspect of all 3 of them to be successful, or they won't even be able to work with those other people.
Yeah, you have to be able to translate your knowledge in other areas, like we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
So we're both aspiring polymaths. I love that. What do you think you can fit on your goal of learning so much? Because when I looked at your website, there was so much to go off of there that I literally created a long novel of questions here. How do you think that you could fit into your aspiration of doing all these different things?
It's challenging. I mean, I've started to realize as I've gone forward that I need to find niches, find ways in within some of these areas. So for example, in medicine, I've actually ended up learning quite a bit of radiology through my PhD work and through living discoveries. But this is something that society is not immediately going to recognize. I don't have a medical degree. I'm not, I haven't done a residency. I haven't done all of the things that a doctor needs to do in order to be licensed to practice medicine. So if I want to do medical research, I need to apply my skills in a more creative way. I need to find a way to get into that field through some other avenue. And that could be through the existing publications that I've made in that area. It could be through starting a company like Living Discoveries. It could be through working with doctors on certain medical research and co-publishing something with them. But I've realized I needed to sociologically find those niches as well.
Yeah, well, and it's almost as if in order to innovate outside the system, you have to work the system to get into it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's, as a summary, that is kind of what I've learned as I've aged, that you can create a new system, but you also still need to work with the existing one. It's not going to just yield because you have something better.
You know what's crazy is that I've learned the same thing as well. It's like I wanted to work in smart city development. That's the kind of field that I want to go into, which you have to have quite interdisciplinary knowledge for, but you also have to be known for it. Not obviously as well defined as a doctor, where you really have to have that degree. But you have to have much more proof than, let's say, electrical engineer per se. You might, yeah, that's not a good example, but regardless, you had to hide that proof. And so that's why I created my own master's degree to pursue towards that. But it's interesting how we both came across the concept of how can we get in the normal system to get to that goal.
Yeah, exactly.
So how can someone be innovative while still thinking interdisciplinary? Which, yeah.
I almost feel like that question, like being interdisciplinary will make them more innovative. So the more subjects that you study, the more creative ideas you'll have. That's actually a fairly well-known result in creativity. Like the bigger the knowledge base you've got, the more ideas you're going to think of because you're able to draw connections between them.
Definitely that generalist approach. Something I actually ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
So a polymath to me has a pretty high bar. It's not a label that I'm comfortable applying to myself just yet. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons I say I aspire to be a polymath, but I don't think I actually am one yet. By the dictionary definition of the word, it's somebody who's basically had achievement in, like a genius level achievement almost, in 2 or more fields. Mm-hmm. Which I don't think is as daunting as people think it is once you've done that in one field. But I also think it requires like moving society in some way, and leaving a mark that's very durable and persistent. And so that's something that could take an entire lifetime to do.
I like that. And I definitely agree. I don't try to consider myself a polymath. I sometimes, for simplicity's sake, label as one, but for the most part, I'm more of a jack of all trades or generalist. I'm at that lower level. I kind of talk about it as in tiers. So jack of all trades is someone at the more basic level. You have a generalist, a more adept or novice interdisciplinary aspect. And then you have more of a polymath, so someone just mastered those levels. Kind of need a journeyman definition as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy, actually. So like a true polymath, like someone who you can point to in a history book, basically, is somebody who's, like a Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, those people. But I think there is a lot of value in the unsung levels of polymathy too, the ones that don't attract quite the level of attention, mm-hmm. But that still follow the same general pattern. And the difference is not necessarily even one of skill. It's also sometimes just one of recognition. And it is in fact possible for recognition to be delayed over time too. A lot of these people were not necessarily recognized fully in their own time.
Like Vincent van Gogh, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting too. I didn't necessarily think about the recognition aspect behind it. And literally the question I had beforehand that we kind of already went over, so I skipped it, is that we're both aspiring polymaths. I even said that in there. And I definitely think that is a good way to go about it, because it almost sounds egotistical if you say, oh, I'm a polymath. I'm someone who's a master of multiple areas. But it is interesting too to think about, like, it is a skill level. I almost wonder if universalist, I think that's how I thought about it, is that you have
universalist is a good type, good title.
You have a jack of all trades, generalist, universalist, and then polymath, and then like a true polymath above that, like Leonardo, where you have kind of almost a scale.
Yeah, that's one way to think of it. I mean, what we do need a label. I think that's key. This community needs something to bring it together. And maybe polymath ends up being that label, and words have definitions, but definitions can change over time. So if that is what people feel resonates with them, then we should modify our use of the word. But going by the current definition anyway, I consider it someone like Leonardo.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I love having someone else explain it because I think that I don't want to be the single voice on this. And what's interesting is that one of my first guests on the show, when he discovered the polymath idea, because he wasn't privy to it beforehand, he realized like, oh, this is a movement. This isn't just one guy speaking it
Right.
out. There's multiple people talking about it. You're one example. I had someone named Eric Wallace who has Polymath Playground, who's also trying to pursue something similar to what we did. And there's multiple people trying to do it. I'm trying to find these people to have on the show, but so if you know someone, let me know. But it's interesting just how we're all trying to create kind of a similar mindset. We're trying to group together and unite.
Right. And maybe that label in that sense is actually a good one to adopt because it connects us with the idea of being like these people. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of value in having that as an aspiration and something to strive for.
And I try to niche it down for myself where as PolyInnovator, as a polymath of innovation, I try to focus more on the innovation side because you could technically polymath lead to innovation no matter what field you're in. But I wanted to lead towards that particular one. What kind of polymath do you think that you would want to be if you were to define it?
So I've never really considered too much the idea of different types of polymaths, but I see myself as somebody who initiates a lot of ideas, who tends to be really good at starting things, to use your sort of breakdown there, a creator. I've always really enjoyed just building things in a hands-on manner as well. And so just starting new projects, working on them, you know, sometimes at the same time.
Yeah, I understand that.
One thing I've actually found is that time management is quite a useful skill if you want to be a master of multiple disciplines. And that's something that actually, if you look through Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and all of those people, they were experts at it. You can see they clearly had to grapple with the same thing.
And you know what's interesting? It's just, I don't want to go too much on a tangent here, but polyphasic sleep cycles. That's something a lot of these greats have gone into, which we could go on a whole nother tangent about it, depending on your knowledge level on it. But it is interesting how they try to minimize how much sleep they had so they can maximize how much time they have.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting experiment. I'm still not sure that it actually works in terms of, like, what you need is you need the best quality of awake time that you can get, not just the best quantity of it.
True.
You want to be in a state where you're energized and you're ready to work on things and you're open to ideas and you're going to create stuff and you're excited. And you can't do that if you're, you know, falling asleep in the middle of the day. So I think it's important to maximize the amount of like good awake time you get.
Well, and there's different sleep cycles too. If you understand the circadian rhythm, a lot of people who might be listening in might be interested in this, is that there's different types of sleep too, and different parts of it are really important, such as the deep sleep cleans out the toxins in the brain, that kind of thing. And if you sleep too little, you don't get into certain cycles.
Yeah, and I think the key is just listen to your body. You know, if you're going on a polyphasic cycle and you're feeling energized all the time and you've got the ability to work on things and you're feeling pumped and you're enjoying life, then go with it. You know, but if you're feeling like you're tired and you're not, you know, able to do what you want to do because you're just not feeling into it, then yeah, maybe reconsider the experiment.
Something I want to ask you then too, since you probably are a little bit farther along than me, is how do you approach time management?
So I've always set across blocks of time. I mentally try to block my day into to specific activities. And usually the night before I'll create a to-do list actually, so I can plan this out rather than it just being how I tend to feel in a certain moment. And if I'm being strategic about it, like sequencing these things as if they were one project, helps me figure out what I need to be working on at any given moment in time. I also do want to allow a certain amount of serendipity there though. Like in music especially, I find sometimes ideas will just come to me whenever they come. And there's value in being able to write something down and then come back to it. Yeah. So typically with music, I'll just record whatever melody just popped into my head. And then go off and do something else and then come back. And actually, usually when I do that, I find I actually think of it in a new way. That's the spaced repetition idea in learning.
Well, you know, it's interesting. When I approached the idea of skill tree-based learning in a modular degree, there was two concepts that I really wanted to approach, is that spaced out repetition, but also interleaving. So you're bridging out two different areas together. And I think you resonate well with that. One thing I want to mention is that I was on the podcast recently, Thinking Like a Genius, which honestly, you would be a perfect guest on if you want to reach out to them. But it's interesting. I can't remember the name this guy had mentioned, but he was mentioning about a certain polymath who was talking about, or a certain genius, I guess you could say, about how he would take down every idea he had and write it on a post-it note. And he had a second brain, as some of the people in Silicon Valley would refer to it. And I think he was actually the originator of this concept. And he had a whole archive of just post-it notes. And he would have a number system so he could refer to it. And he was able to go back to those one single ideas if you wanted to go back on it. And I think that's a very important concept of organizational aspect.
Yeah, so I mean, the good thing is now we have tons of digital organizers that can do all that without the clutter of the Post-its.
Mm-hmm.
I find, of course, a good old-fashioned whiteboard is still very helpful. Yeah, great minds think alike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a digital tool of preference?
Just Trello. I basically, I do the digital equivalent of what you just described. I have a bunch of Trello boards, and I'll just sequence different breakdowns of the ideas that I've got. And after a while, you know, if something isn't something that gets reactivated by a lot of different creative ideas that I think of, then it will just eventually sort of slide to the right. You know, and eventually it will just be off of the Trello page, and there will be other things that are in the foreground.
Making use of that Kanban board system. You know, I actually use Notion, which you might be interested in. We can talk more about it after the show. But
haven't seen that one.
It combines like documentations, databases, and Kanban boards all into one tool. Notion.so is the website URL.
Cool.
It's one of the few tools that I swear by. I moved my entire life system into it just because it was so uniquely effective.
Sounds great. Yeah, I'll take a look at it.
So one thing is that how do you approach the idea of creating a new type of university and this heavily interdisciplinary curriculum? We kind of talked on it a little bit, but how do you think that we could approach it, or how have you wanted to approach it?
So the way that I've attempted to approach it in the past was building up the courses first. If you want to start a school, you should show people that you could actually teach them. And I think that idea still has legs. I just think that there are certain dependencies in place, like having back then, maybe having a physical campus space. Maybe now it's not so much of a limiter anymore. Getting faculty on board, going through accreditation requirements. There are certain aspects of starting a school that you have to abide by if you actually want to legitimately grant people degrees.
So it is interesting you say that. I actually thought the same thing about having courses on there. That's why I had the self-education mini course, and I was working on the modular degree course before something happened, technically problem. But elaborate more on the accreditation, because that's something I've had difficulty accepting personally.
Yeah, so I mean, the accreditation requirements aren't too onerous. We believe that we would actually be able to meet most of the accrediting standards. So there, in the US, you have to get accredited as a university by one of the regional accrediting organizations. Middle States, Mid-Atlantic, there are a bunch of others too, but those are the ones that I'm familiar with. And they have a certain set of requirements. I think they require that you have at least a one-year curriculum. You can't grant degrees with less than 1 year of education. You also need to have sufficient resources to ensure that your students can actually go through the program. Like, they don't want schools shutting down midway through someone's degree program and then everybody has to transfer. You know, that's usually disruptive, and I understand why they would require that. And then you have a bunch of other different sort of, like, you have to offer a certain amount of English, you have to offer a certain amount of, you know, you have certain common requirements that you can't shirk. Like
gen eds and whatnot. So
yeah, the gen eds, exactly.
I don't know if it's the anti-conformist in me or whatnot, but I kind of scoffed at that idea of getting accredited. Is that, in your opinion, a bad thing, or do you think that we should approach the accreditation if you want to be more professional in a way?
So I think that's just another barrier that if you're trying to start this is another way my thinking has changed over the years, actually. It's a barrier in terms of getting something out. Okay. So if you want to show value to people, you need to find a way to do so, obviously, without an accredited degree. So you'll need something more modular, most likely some sort of certification or something. But I think it's worth exploring that concept with minimal risk. You know, that's what they teach you in entrepreneurship, and I think it's actually quite a valuable thing. Try to minimize the uncertainty around getting your idea out, and test it, you know, and see if it has legs, and then you can try to do the heavier weight things.
I really appreciate you going into that too, because that's, for the modular degree, it's actually something very important to that, and it's going to be a stepping stone that we're going to keep facing with PolyInnovator. But there is a system that's being idealized out there called the universal learning points kind of idea. Not sure if you're familiar, which you might be.
I haven't seen that one.
I don't remember who cultivated it. In fact, I should find out so I could have him on the show, ironically. But this kind of system where if you can quantify an education tool, like let's say a MOOC or a podcast episode or some kind of YouTube video, some kind of education resource, even an audiobook, if you can quantify how many learning points it has, and you can translate, it's like a credit system for accreditation, how many credits you need to graduate, I guess you could say.
Right.
But it's more universal, whereas each of these accreditation bureaus you mentioned, the regional ones, they all have their own relatively different system. They can translate to each other, but that's a whole process that's not necessary in the grand scheme of things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. If you can identify the salient points in a curriculum, or even a single MOOC, I suppose, then you can break it down and you can actually assign credit for them.
So when I created my own modular degree, I actually started out with almost like 450 courses and micro credentials as well, which are groups of MOOCs. And that's one thing that I realized it's not going to work. So I cut it down a few different times since then. Now I think it's around 120, which is still a lot. But if you compare it to a bachelor's degree, it's about the same hours, so to speak.
Right.
And if you apply speed reading and listen to videos at a higher speed, that kind of thing, you can get through it quicker. Depends on your retention levels, obviously. But what is your take on online education then as a whole?
Oh, I'm very much in favor of it. So I think we're experimenting now with newer, more modular types of learning. And I think this can only be a good thing. I don't think they're going to replace offline learning completely. There are still some very valuable aspects of the campus experience. As I said, I think the relationships that you build with other people and the chances to collaborate with them in a kind of intense and in-person way, those are valuable. And I think those may be undervalued by people in society sometimes.
I agree.
But the learning resources, the courses, the lectures, the group chats, those things I think are quite useful as well. And I see them as another tool in the toolbox, so to speak.
So your creative portfolio is quite expanding from the visuals to the auditory. How do you express your creativity?
I mean, to me, some of it is just following the ideas, so to speak. I get very interested in certain aspects of the world sometimes. How things, for example, in photography, light was what drew me in. Seeing the different qualities of light and trying to reproduce each of those individual qualities and sort of capture what I was feeling in a particular moment. In music, it's also, it's like the melodies just kind of come to me, but you have to be receptive to them. And where I think each of those has started is cultivating an open type of mindset towards new ideas. So like just being willing and fearless to just jump into a new area and say, you know, there's a new type of idea here. I want to explore it. Let me pursue it.
I love that. It's a growth mindset.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you can accomplish that, you'll be in an uncomfortable place sometimes. You know, you'll be learning new instruments or picking up new skills, but you will be exposed to a much wider range of ideas.
You mentioned the photography. I actually came across your pictures on Behance, which are really good.
Oh, nice.
You said the lighting was your fascination with it. What about it?
The different qualities of light. So in photography, we would say there's soft light, which is sort of like what you'd see on a foggy day. There's hard light, which is what you'd see when the sun is shining down, you know, like on top of a mountain, let's say. There's light at different angles, different colors of light, different what we call color temperatures surrounding them. There's contrast in light. One of the best photos I've taken actually was of a small plant just on the forest floor, and everything else was dark, and the plant was just lighting up. And the contrast there was what created the visual interest.
Yeah.
So exploring that more.
I actually totally understand that particular concept you're employing there, where there was one day I was just walking in a parking lot, and in between the parking space and the concrete of the little wall right next to the grass, there was this one flower sprouting up through the concrete. And the contrast between the flower and the lighting of it, because it was a bright sunny day, I was able to take a nice picture of it and just see the contrast between the lighting of it. Not the filter on top of it on Instagram or something like that, but just a natural lighting contrast.
Yeah, and I mean, that's always been the type of photography I've been drawn to. You have many different types of photography. You've got journalistic photography, where
Hmm.
you can try to make a point with your photographs to represent something about society. You have portrait photography, where you're trying to show something about a person. I've always been interested in nature, so I try to depict the outdoors to show people what the wild looks like in a new way.
What is your naturalistic intelligence like then?
So I mean, I don't know if I would call it naturalistic intelligence necessarily, but I've definitely had quite an enjoyment of nature. One of the reasons I moved out to the West Coast, it's not just Silicon Valley, it's also the proximity to Yosemite.
Hmm.
And it's been a little bit unfortunate that the pandemic happened when it did, because I feel like I haven't quite gotten to exercise that quite as much.
Hmm.
But I find that nature recharges me. I need it. Without it, I feel like eventually I start to just, I burn out.
Yeah.
But like going for walks is something that I find to be very useful. I think of a lot of ideas on walks. Going to different parks, like just seeing different aspects of nature. Um, it's important, I think, for like the overall balance of my life.
Well, when did you move then?
Moved in the end of 2018.
Okay. So there is the reason why I mentioned naturalistic intelligence is that Gardner, I don't remember his first name,
Yeah,
he introduced the multiple intelligence for those in the audience who don't know what we're talking about
right.
here. But do you feel like you've approached many intelligences? I mean, this comes back to the polymath idea, but how many have you actively worked towards?
So I've got to remember the different ones in Gardner's model. I think he had,
I can list them out here if you'd like. The
yeah, sure.
visual, spatial, linguistic, verbal, interpersonal, intrapersonal, logical, mathematical, musical, body kinesthetic, and naturalistic.
Sounds good. There were more of them than I originally remembered.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to exercise them in turn, I'd say. So I started out, I would say, mostly along the intellectual and perhaps musical and perhaps visual spatial. But over time, I feel like I've been developing my interpersonal intelligence much more. Part of this is that I've actually been making a conscious effort to do so over time. I've gotten more into management in terms of my overall career. And that has taught me a lot about interfacing with other people and understanding their needs and trying to take care of what they're doing. Yeah, I've been basically trying to build them all in turn. And I started out as kind of like a very classical, like I'm going to think about things for a while and write down the answer. And over time, I think I've broadened out much more.
It seems like your communication's quite up to par, so I think you've done quite well on that.
Oh, thanks.
It's interesting too that you approach that idea of like, I need to improve this. There's a lot of people who are naturally extroverted or naturally gregarious who think that they're very good at communicating, but then they find out some the hard way, either through relationships or events, and they're like, oh, okay, I actually do need to get better at this as a skill or an intelligence.
Right, and I think interpersonal intelligence is not necessarily just a matter of how well you socialize, although that probably helps. But it's the ability to empathize with people, to understand their motivations, to be able to influence their motivations in some ways, hopefully in positive ways, but you could also use interpersonal intelligence negatively, potentially.
Manipulation, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I've always subscribed, particularly in a leadership context, that you should be trying to help the people that you're working with and lead them towards something that's going to be better, not just for you, but for them as well. But I've seen enough of the other type in society to know that that's not always the way it works.
I definitely agree to what you're saying. I try to employ the same philosophy. And it is interesting that it's not just socialization, it's also being able to read somebody, like their body language, and see how they're feeling. And like you said, empathize with that.
Yeah. And when you get to the point when you can immediately tell that, let's say you made a decision and somebody on your team, let's say, got upset. If you can identify that before they even have to tell you they're upset, then you'll be able to, because maybe they won't. They might just say, oh yeah, that's okay. I'm not thrilled about that, but all right. You'll be able to really understand what's going on and you'll be more effective at leading those people.
It's interesting you say that. I actually got in trouble because of my systematic thinking, where I saw systems in place at my workplace that I wanted to fix. I wanted to try to change in a better way. Yeah, you can have an example too. We'll get into then I see. But and I've always been a pretty good person to be able to socialize. I've always been over talkative, so that's been a learning experience as a host to quiet my mouth and be an active listener. but being able to articulate what I was trying to do was I failed at, and I didn't actually accomplish the goal I wanted to do. So what's an experience you were kind of thinking of there?
I mean, there could have been a bit of that perhaps at Niantic. Not to criticize too much, because I believe it was actually quite a nice workplace. But one of the struggles I had there was basically what you were just describing. There were certain decisions being made that like I felt like they could have been more optimal. Certain systems that were in place that could have been fixed. And trying to break through the power structures there and actually communicate with people, manage upwards essentially, as they say. That proved to be one of the most challenging aspects, and probably an area that I can continue to try to improve in.
And I think it comes down to your network too. If you had a connection with the CEO or something like that, more personal, you'd be able to effectively do that. But I get what you're saying, and I'm sorry that that wasn't able to be affected in the way that you wanted to be. So I guess this comes down to the next area of your life too. What brought you to Facebook then? What excited you about that new prospect?
I mean, so I've always been looking to lead larger groups of people, to be centrally involved in what was going on, and to try and deliver value. I've always had a philosophy of like moving really fast and trying to like violating preconceptions almost, like adding things in a surprisingly short amount of time. And a lot of companies really don't get on board with that. They think there are certain assumptions I've heard very often throughout my career. Like it will take at least a year to ramp up in a new project and deliver something of value. And I mean, I've violated that so many times in my career. Oh, that's my cat.
Hi, Kitty.
Yeah. Hi, Layla.
I love cats. Cats are awesome.
Yeah. So over my career, I've proved that wrong so many times that I feel at this point it's almost like a broken record repeating it to people. But I thrive on that. I thrive on building new things out, on creating new teams, on delivering things of value to organizations, or just the world in general.
Mm-hmm. You're an ideation person, I can tell. And I totally resonate with what you're saying there, and how there's some things you just want to be able to do. You want to be able to fix things and make them better, but in certain corporate structures, you're not able to do so.
Right. And so one of Facebook's principles is literally move fast.
Mm.
So I'm hoping that translates into like having more creative freedom to do exactly that.
I'm really excited to see how it evolves and how we're able to interconnect in a much more deeper level.
Yeah.
I think Facebook's actual philosophy is quite beyond that. Like they're trying to find ways for people to connect more deeply. I was actually listening to Peter Thiel on an audiobook at one point where he was talking about how when he invested in Facebook, he was talking to Mark, and there was that point where they wanted to try to convince Mark Zuckerberg to sell. But Mark was like, okay, what would I do with that money if I were to sell out and make the profit off of this? And what would I do with the money that I generated from that? Well, I want to create a social network for people. And so like, why would I want to sell out if I'm already doing that?
So then why stop doing that then?
So going into kind of this idea of you completed your dissertation a while back, a little over a decade ago, actually, not a while back. So what was that on? Would you care to elaborate on it?
So the dissertation work, I mean, I wish I could say it was some sort of magnum opus, but like really it was just, it was a dissertation. Mm-hmm. It was the culmination of a process that was long and was not necessarily the most like relevant thing. But what I did my thesis work on was machine learning applied to medicine. Mm. So as I was saying, applying it to medical imaging and trying to diagnose various abnormalities within scans. The techniques that we used were, they were methods that were usually used for graph or network recommendation, like being able to connect the user with a product, let's say. But it turns out when you combine them with certain signal processing techniques, you could actually apply them in images as well. Mm. So that was the novelty of the work. And then based on that, I thought that would have been something that the medical companies perhaps were interested in and could have launched a career in medicine that way. But actually the main interest that I saw there was around the optimization of large graph data, which was ultimately what led to Google having interest.
That's awesome. And I mentioned earlier that my goal is more smart city development. Yours seems to be kind of in the medical area. I wonder how those might mesh together. I've seen in Singapore, for example, certain apartments for the elderly have a lot more sensors for the IoT system, be able to monitor, hey, did this person fall? Does this person need medical assistance because of their heart rate or something like that? Where do you see data being able to be a big force in that?
I mean, I think if you can put the sensors in the right place, you can have quite an impact using the data that they collect. So the quantified self movement is kind of an example of, you know, you put a sensor in somebody's arm, and now you could actually get real-time information about what's going on with their bodies. And in the case of certain populations that are sort of medically vulnerable, I think that is that's quite a useful innovation, because it will allow people to intervene faster when some parameter of their health starts to go in the wrong direction.
Quite eloquently said. That's fantastic. Going off something that you said earlier is that you would like to, that on your website, actually, I want to reiterate, I have made it one of my life's goals to see the implementation of Project Polymath, a plan for a new type of university with heavily interdisciplinary curriculum. I'd like to go back into that.
Sounds great. So yeah, I mean, I think that is going to probably take the majority of my life, and I think it's actually quite good to have a life goal that's lofty and that can change society. Because as I mentioned, I think that scaling up the ability to churn out creators is going to be what ends up changing society. And that's kind of a recurring theme of my goals. Like, I believe that if you can do well by individuals, you usually will also raise the level of the society.
Yes. So I can't believe how much we are aligned in our thinking, because like I said, the United Living Construct, the whole point of that was to pursue a hub of innovation of people in that course.
Yep.
The slogan of that was world unity through self-education or self-development. And so
that's a good name.
Yeah, well, we thought about how both of us are saying, like, we need to build up the people first, and then society as a whole will be built up. I love how we both came across that same thesis as well.
Yeah, and I mean, education is a tool for doing that. You want to give people the ability to share their ideas and actualize their ideas and contribute to society in some way, because I think right now there's just a barrier. You know, there are lots of people who could be changing the world in positive ways, but they don't have the ability to, or the system isn't really permitting them to explore their ideas in the way that they need to.
Where do you think that personal brands or these influencers online, like some people see those two terms as something kind of scummy or spammy in a way, but they're just an online presence. It's just your online reputation, so to speak. We both have personal brands, like your website and my PolyInnovator site, that neither one of those are spammy or anything like that. We both wanted to do it in an effort to help people and create this new change. And I think there's a lot of creators out there who are trying to do that. Where do you see that kind of new business term evolving into?
Yeah, so I think one of the nicest things about being multi-talented is that you can customize that personal brand for a situation. Most people will have just one personal brand. As a universal thinker, you could have more than one. You could have your personal branding in music, let's say, or your personal branding in photography, or your personal branding just, you know, in general in your career. And you can use these in various contexts depending on what situation you're trying to apply it to. In order to get attention and you know, create buzz around what you're doing. I don't consider it a scummy thing, really. I think it's just an aspect of marketing.
Yeah.
You need to be able to capture people's attention, especially today. Like, given the sheer number of creators that are out there, there's a lot of noise that people have to wade through in order to find you particularly. And I think so you have to learn that.
Yeah, and I don't personally think it's bad or anything like that. I just know that there's some business people of notoriety who think it is. And I think that it's evolving into this online reputation, this personal brand, and people who are creating for the sake of creating valuable content, I think are the ones who are actually clearing out through the noise. And a lot of these great minds in business always say niche down, focus on one thing. And as a polymath, or aspiring polymath, actually, I would say, it was hard for me to do so. So what I try to do, which I think you might like, is approach it in phases. So like you said earlier, music, that's something that I actually want to go into myself down the line. Another one is video games, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that right off the bat unless I focus purely on that. So my first focus is self-education. That's where I created a modular degree in that. What is necessarily your first phase, I think, going forward?
That's a good question. I think the first phase I've had of my own branding was probably in the education space as well. So I started off, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to start that university, and I approached it fairly directly in the beginning. The one that stuck, of course, was more the programming background, because we're kind of in an era now where that's just extremely highly valued.
Yeah.
But I think the more fundamental one is actually the educational aspect, and that's just something that's going to take some time for society to realize.
Definitely. And so between Amplify Education, one of your endeavors, and the Project Polymath and the Mountaintop program, you seem to be having that strong ambition towards that revolutionary education. What could you think could bridge those three areas and those three projects in the future?
So I think the key there was that those were opportunities to apply the programming and the rest of my background to education.
Okay.
And things immediately become much more interesting when you start finding the intersections of those different aspects. So Amplify Education was an ed tech company. It was also a chance to lead. I mean, I was leading their Amplify tablet, which was a device that improved K-12 classroom learning. The software development on it, I should say specifically, not the whole tablet project. It was a chance to unify some of those. And going forward, I'd like to do more of that. I'd like to find more ways to unify kind of what the world values about me with what I want to be changing about it.
One thing I've kind of gotten from your personal brand, especially on your website, actually, you called yourself a programming prodigy. Please tell me more about that.
Yes, so a lot of that is really just branding. But so in the truest sense of the word, a prodigy is somebody who demonstrates a fairly high level of skill at a fairly young age. And my first achievement, actually, one of the very first things that attracted public attention was a game I created called Metasquarer back in, I believe it was 1996. I was 12 at the time. And that was basically a game that America Online used to run by a company called Meta Creations. They took it offline, and Metasquarer was the recreation of that game. So they took it off. I said, no, you're not taking it off. I'm going to do this myself.
Love it.
And yeah, and it ended up becoming quite popular. One of the kind of surreal things about that was that in high school, I was not very tuned in with high school. It was kind of a waste of my time. The work was not engaging. I wasn't into it. But I would actually go home, and then I would go from being this like high school student who just didn't speak out much and the teachers didn't particularly like, and then I'd be running a community of like 10,000 plus people playing this online game. Yeah. And it was weird trying to just juxtapose both of those things with each other.
Well, and you know what's interesting? One other thing I resonate with you is that high school was a waste of time for me too. Like one of my best learning experiences in school was when I went to the library. And I said this so many times on the podcast, so people are tired of hearing it. But I went to the library of my school and burned through the philosophy and world religion section about a matter of a few months. I just read so much, which is my biggest reading experience in my entire life, I would even say, because I was just so involved in it. And it was a self-education endeavor. It had nothing to do with school.
Yeah, it was actually kind of odd. So in high school, I would do like the book behind the book thing. Only the book behind the book wouldn't be like a comic book. It would actually be like Dante's Divine Comedy or something.
Yeah.
And I would basically get all of my reading in while I was supposed to be like reading other things.
Now, speaking of comic books, I actually did sneak comic books into school, but that was probably like 5th grade or something like that.
Yeah, not saying there's anything wrong about that. I just thought it was funny because you usually think of the concept as, you're doing something for entertainment. And I guess reading those books was entertainment, but it was very different than what probably people thought I was reading.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting too, is that you can never really know what's going on in someone's brain. And that's one reason why I definitely wanted you coming on the show. And I'm so glad that you have been, because I wanted to see what your brain would say and like how you would approach things. And so that example there, like people would think you're reading one book, but in the inside, you're reading something else. Yeah. So you never can really understand what's going on in someone's head unless you ask them. And even then you won't even get the whole picture.
Right, and that's something that like the model of high school education is always really bad at. Asking people anything is not what they do.
Well, and that goes back to something we mentioned towards the beginning of the podcast too today, is that the schools are developed for specialists and for people who are able to retain a certain knowledge, not interdisciplinary knowledge.
Right, and particularly in the before you get to college, like a lot of that education is really designed around a basic set of knowledge. Accumulating some sort of base of facts. But I think if we can drive more creativity into the process, like the one thing I want people to take away from this is we need to be driving more creativity into education. We need to be giving people the opportunity to come up with their own ideas and to have the chance to showcase them and develop them and turn them into things. Because if we can change the way people think about that, that will be more powerful than even the actual innovations that come out of it.
Well, it comes down to how you learn too. So as you probably know well too, if you don't have an interest in something, you're not going to try to pursue that knowledge. Like you were interested in Dante's, and so you went out of your way to learn that instead of what you're learning in school. And so what you're interested in is definitely going to be something that we need to apply in education, which isn't currently the system. And so I think that being able to apply that ideation with the interest level is really important, which is what I try to go with the modular degree framework, is that I want to get people into the state of flow. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Every programmer has to be familiar with that.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that no matter what field you're in, there's some kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not alternative, but basically their own word for it. So in programming, I don't remember, what's the programming word for flow?
I usually just use flow, but I've heard people call it like being in the zone or like plugged in or whatever.
I think that's what I remember hearing people say. So like programmers will say plugged in or in the zone. Sports people will say in the zone or runner's high. And then I don't remember how I really got into it, but for the most part, exercise was my entryway into flow. So let's kind of go into that. What's your experience with it?
I mean, I think it's a critical experience to cultivate if you're doing any sort of intense knowledge-driven work. So if you're programming, for example, you've got a very focused task, and you need to concentrate. It takes uninterrupted effort. So being in the flow state, that's when you can perform at your best.
And one thing I think is interesting is that with this conversation, for example, and other ones I've had on the Polycast, I've been able to get into flow or a very heightened state of focus because I'm so interested in what you guys had to say. And I love how this interpersonal connection we can make, this networking that we're able to do is able to get me into that. What's your best experience with flow?
It's usually in a programming context, but it's interesting that you bring up also that it can happen in an interpersonal context. Because it does actually happen when you're in an engaged conversation that just kind of takes over the full spectrum of your attention. And you're not thinking about it anymore. It's just kind of happening. So it's interesting that you bring that up.
Do you have any other tangents off of that idea, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the programming accomplishments that I've created, certainly Metasquare was one of the better ones. Some of the startups, I probably spent the majority of my time developing those in a flow state. And really, you need to cultivate it. That's the key. You need to create an environment where that can just happen.
I think minimalism helps with that quite a bit. Both of our spaces are pretty minimal.
Yeah.
And then it also comes down to your space will influence your mind. So if you have a cluttered space, your mind's going to feel rather cluttered as well. And then there's Atomic Habits by James Clear that talks about minimizing the barriers to a certain habit or system that you're applying.
Yep.
And then one thing I was thinking about with a skill tree based learning is with that choice that we talked about earlier, when you have a choice of what you can learn, you get into that interest level much more deeply, and that can induce flow because of that.
Right. It's also a matter of the challenge you're taking on. So if you're stretching yourself just a little bit, this ties into the classical theory of flow, I think. If you're stretching yourself just a bit beyond your level of competency, then you're likely to hit flow. If you go too far out, you're actually in a frustrating place because you don't have enough skill yet to do it. And if you're too far on the other side, you're just bored. Yeah. But if you can just find those challenges that just require you to go a little bit out of your comfort zone and keep building on that, then you'll be in a flow state much more.
One more example of that is Tetris. I actually got really into Tetris as a mental stimuli. I really wanted to try to train my brain at a focused state. And I remember at one point I played a marathon version of Tetris where you're just going to different levels. And I got to, I don't know what the limit was on levels, but I got to level 30, I think, on this marathon. And before this, my highest was 15. And I was in such a zone. It was such a state of flow that by the end of it, I was like, whoa, I don't even remember what happened. I was listening to a song through the Dragon Force, Through the Fire and Flames, which is, for many people who've played Rock Band or Guitar Hero, they know it as a really loud, heavy metal song. But it's very interesting how that induced it quite a bit too.
Yeah, music helps a lot. And there's different types of music that I find are useful for different activities. I like vocal music when I'm doing something that involves work that doesn't require quite as much focus. But when I'm doing something like programming, let's say, I find the words actually start to interfere with my thoughts.
Yeah.
So I've usually switched over to instrumental music when I'm doing something like that.
Speaking of music, actually, there's been a lot of compilations about like the hacker music or programming music where it's just
Oh, I've
all
seen that.
pure instrumental. I love it.
Yeah.
What have you ever listened to Epic Music?
Oh yeah, Epic Music's great. I'm a big fan of Thomas Bergerson in particular.
Yes. And Two Steps from Hell, obviously, in that case too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have some really good stuff. Flight of Silverbird's probably my favorite.
Blackheart would be mine if you've heard of
Oh,
it.
Blackheart's a good one too. Yeah.
It was actually my introduction, I think, into it, which is why it's so powerful to me. So this actually leads to one of my final questions I want to ask you too, is that music as a form, as well as just embodies the soul itself, or will, interpersonal will. What do you think of music creation?
Yeah, so that's a very Schopenhauer type of thing. Like music is the expression of the will, I think he said, or something like that. I mean, to me, it's a form, like I said, I like to be open to ideas. I think in a sort of poetic sense, the ideas speak to me. That sounds very pretentious somehow. But I feel like there are certain things that just kind of like pop into my head, and melodies are one form of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to be open, like, in terms of music, that means, you know, I'll look for different types. I'll explore. I won't cast judgment on any particular piece until I've had a chance to hear it thoroughly. And I've developed my preferences, of course. I don't like all forms of music equally, but I want to make sure I'm always keeping open, because that will help me think of new things too.
Have you ever tried music in different languages?
Yes, I have actually. I actually like, I don't have a particular language in mind, but I like world music generally. The different instruments, the different arrangements. Some of them have quarter tone scales and things. It's quite interesting.
I particularly love Bollywood music.
Oh, Bollywood's pretty good too.
It's so much fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it didn't sound pretentious when you said that at all. It sounds very metaphysical, and I think that goes into the philosophy of your life, and I love that.
Cool.
So kind of wrapping up today, I have loved the conversation we've been in. Like we said, we got into flow. I'm glad to be able to talk to another aspiring polymath. A lot of people that I've had on here are either entrepreneurs or aspiring polymaths, and I love how there's a definitely culmination between the two with you here today. And I think that's really the beauty of the podcast as well. Where can people find you online?
So you can always reach out. My personal website is literally just my name, barnathan.net, BARNATHAN. And you can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty accessible by email as well. So, and of course, check out Project Polymath as well. That's projectpolymath.org.
I will definitely have the links in the description. I have Project Polymath, Mountaintop, that kind of thing.
Perfect.
Whenever people come to this podcast, I always try to leave on a call to action. Obviously, checking out your stuff is a very good call to action. I think it's very, people could go to it. But in a different sense, what do you think people can do as a call to action today?
I think the main thing is keep pushing for the changes that you know need to exist in the world. Like I think one of the things that unites us is we all see a better model to what's currently out there. We're living in a very specialized society, and we're all going against that grain to some degree. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on this show. So I think continuing to push for that and spread for that, your idea is correct. It is valuable. It is better than what is currently out there. And I think, you know, just continue pushing.
I love it. And then do you have any new endeavors that you're working towards right now besides working at Facebook?
Still trying to get the lay of the land there, but I've got a couple of things cooking. Nothing I'm really ready to talk about yet, though, unfortunately.
Next time on the podcast then.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.